morning, friends, and welcome. This is the day that the Lord has made, and we shall rejoice and be glad in it. Now, today I'm going to be talking to you about Moses and Jethro and how Jethro played an influential role in the life of Moses and ultimately in the unfolding of the redemption plan of God. Now, Moses finds himself in Midian. Now, he's 80 years old. He's on the mountain of God. He's in the desert, and he's a shepherd. He's no longer a prince. And now remember, the first 40 years of Moses' life, he lived the life of a prince. He understood what it was like to be in government. He understood what it was like to have the benefits of being a prince in Egypt. But now he is in Midian, and he is a shepherd. And God speaks to Moses, and God basically comes to Moses and says to him, listen, I've heard the cries of the people. I've seen what they've gone through. And so I'm going to deal with Pharaoh. I'm going to take my people out of Egypt. I'm going to lead them out. And then he says to Moses, but I'm sending you to Pharaoh. Now, if I was Moses, I would have been so excited, because I've always had this dream, and it even seemed like a dream deferred. It even seems like a vision that has been crushed, because there was this desire to see my people being set free. And there was a time when I acted in immaturity, I acted in zeal without knowledge, and guess what? The dream was deferred. The vision became crushed. But now God, when God spoke to Moses, imagine what went through the heart of Moses. Moses is kneeling there before God, and he is saying, God is saying to him, I will do all of these things. Now, if I was Moses, I would get so excited, man. I'm kneeling, there's like, what? Tears rolling down my face as I kneel and I listen to God, because it's been a dream of mine. My people being set free, them deciding for themselves where they will live, them deciding for themselves how they will conduct their lives, not being told by a master how to conduct their lives. And so Moses hears God on the mountain, and as I say, you can find that in Genesis 3. Now, Pharaoh has died. Now, God told Moses that Pharaoh has died. Now, the people that wanted you dead, the people that wanted to get rid of you, they are no longer there. They're no longer in charge. They're no longer in power. They are gone. Now, with a change of administration in Egypt, there are new opportunities, new personalities, new characters. And so with a governmental change, with a new administration, there are new policies. What will this government say about the housing policy? What will this government say about the foreign policy? And so within this environment of new possibilities, God drops in the unfolding of his plan of salvation. Not just the plan of salvation for Israel, but the plan of salvation ultimately, because the Messiah must come through the lineage of Judah, and Judah is part of Israel. And so that plan, that unfolding of the plan, God just deposits some of the seeds, because within the next few months there must come a change. Now, like I said, it's been 40 years since Moses had this desire to be with his people. It's been 40 years that as a prince, he knew that he needed to be defined by the word of God. He needed to find out the history of his people. He needed to be with them. Now, we can read there together in Acts 7, the book of Acts, from chapter 7, from verse 22, and we will read verse 23 as well. Now, let us read together, and it says, Moses was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was powerful in speech and action. Note this. He was educated in all the wisdom of Egypt. And he was powerful in speech and action. Now, in the book of Genesis, Moses says to God, I'm not that well of an orator. I don't speak that well. But the writer of Acts says, no, Moses was actually a good speaker. And so it also says that he was a man of action. He was a man of action. And then we read in verse 23, when Moses was 40 years old, he decided to visit his own people, the Israelites. Now, very interestingly here, the writer of the book of Acts says, Moses will want to do what? Visit his own people. Now, he grew up with the identity of an Egyptian, the hairstyle of an Egyptian. He had the food of an Egyptian. So that still was not enough to define him. And that still was not enough to take away that identity in the nation of Israel, within the purpose of God, within the plan of God. Because it is the plan of God, it is the purpose of God that will ultimately let us understand our purpose so much better, and we will be able to define ourselves so much better within that purpose. Now, what does it mean to be educated within the wisdom of Egypt? What does it mean? It means that he was taught in pre-primary, in primary, in high school, in Egyptian university, and obviously I'm making it up, but I'm trying to put it within the context of today so that you understand that Moses, that as he grew up in the household of Pharaoh, as he grew up, he was taught how to understand the ways of Egypt. And the ways of Egypt were very important. He had to understand the language of Egypt in the same way that the Hebrew boys that were taken to Babylon, they were taught the ways, the language of Babylon. And so in all of this, it was basically Moses. He was taught the wisdom of Egypt, and that wisdom was basically caught up within the understanding of the Egyptian world. What is the cosmology? Where do they fit in? Who are the gods? Who do they worship? What is their theology? How do they understand the world? And how does that translate into their lives? How they interact with one another, how they interact with other people groups, how they interact with other nations. And that is what he had learned in Egypt. Now remember, Egypt for 3,000 years was the leading civilization in the world. And sometimes we forget that. Sometimes we don't want to focus on that, and we forget that the arts, the sciences, military conquests, all of this, Egypt was the leading civilization It was the leading civilization in the world for 3,000 years. Now, within this, he had to learn the poetry of Egypt. But he had to learn the names of the gods, the names of the river god, the names of the agricultural god, the names of the gods of fertility, and all of these gods of Egypt. But Moses knew that he might have grown up as an Egyptian. He might have enjoyed the benefits of an Egyptian. He might have enjoyed the benefits of an Egyptian prince, but his true identity was not in the ways of Egypt. His true identity was not in the ways of the courts of Pharaoh. His true identity was with his people. And so I want to repeat what it says there in Acts 7 verse 23. It says, when Moses was 40 years old, he decided to visit his own people, the Israelites. You see, there comes a time when a man and a woman need to decide that the family situation where they find themselves in, or where they located, is that ultimately where they want to be? Or do they want to be defined by something else? Now, yes, we find ourselves in families and culture groups, but ultimately we need to find and know that we are defined by God and where He locates us and where He puts us. And sometimes we need to understand that there is a brother, that there's a friend who sticks closer than a brother. Now, Moses also knew that he's in the world of the Egyptians, but he was not of the world of the Egyptians. And doesn't that remind us of what Jesus says in John 17 verse 16? Now, Jesus says the following: they are not of the world, even as I am not of it. Talking about who? The followers of Jesus. And Jesus says they are what? They are not of this world. And so we need to understand that we are part of the household of the Father. And ultimately, we need to understand that we are not of this world. And being part of the household of the Father is much more important and takes priority in terms of living our lives, working out purpose in our lives, and defining who we are. Now, if you find yourself within Egypt, Egypt will define you. Egypt will say to you, this is how you clothe yourself. Egypt will define you to say, this is how you have your hairstyles. Egypt will say to you, this is how you relate to other people, because it is according to the standards of Egypt. But in the same way, the kingdom of God, the household of the Father, has its standards. And its standards starts off with that you must love the Lord your God with all of your heart. And to sum up all the other laws of the kingdom of our Father, it says, how should you relate with others? You should relate with them in love, the same way you love yourself. The way you treat other people is a reflection in terms of how you value yourself and how you see yourself. And the world standard will always bring flesh. And apologies for this, I just need to move my notes here. But Moses knew he was in Egypt, but he was not of Egypt. He knew that he was identified as an Egyptian by clothing and everything else, but he knew that he was a Hebrew. You see, the world will be able to tell you a lot of things, and they will come with their facts and their version of how they see things, but ultimately the truth will set us free. The truth of who we are, the truth of who our Father is. The truth will set us free. Romans 12 verse 2 says, "Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind." And Moses understood that it was not the standard of Egypt. It was not all of those standards that had to be the pattern that he had to follow. But he understood that there was another pattern here. There was a pattern that the Israelites follow. They were different than the rest of the people in Egypt. And he understood for him to get into that, he needed to fellowship with his brothers and sisters so that they can tell him about what? About what God had done in the life of Abraham, in the life of Isaac, in the life of Jacob. And that is how they ended up in Egypt. He needed to understand the promises. He needed to understand the covenant that God had made with his forefathers. And so, in the same way, we must be transformed by those things, those stories that God had done in our lives, those incidents that had taken place in the lives of our culture group, of our nations, of our families. We must get to a point where we understand what it is, where we have come from. And Moses wanted to understand that, and he understood that that there had to be a transformation of information. He had to be a transformation in terms of how he thinks, that he couldn't just think like an Egyptian anymore, but he had to think like a Hebrew. Now, Moses was a descendant of Abram, Isaac, and Jacob, or Israel, depending on how you want to call Jacob. And in all of that, it means that Moses was supposed to be a shepherd if he had not grown up in the courts of Pharaoh. It means that he would have learned what it means to go after that lost sheep. It means he would have understood what it means to stink like sheep, because every shepherd will smell like the sheep. And if you know of a shepherd that does not smell like the sheep, I can tell you it is not a shepherd. Maybe it is the butcher. Maybe it is the chef. But a shepherd smells like the sheep. Now, where am I going with this? When Jacob moved to Egypt, Joseph told his brothers, and he said to his brothers the following. Now, let's read. You can go to Genesis 46, and we will read verses 33 to 34. Genesis 46, verse 33 to 34, and it states, "When Pharaoh calls you in," now this is Joseph speaking to his brothers, and he says, "When Pharaoh calls you in and asks, 'What is your occupation?' you should answer, 'Your servants have tended livestock from our boyhood on, just as our fathers did.' Then you will be allowed to settle in the region of Goshen, for all shepherds are detestable to the Egyptians." The Egyptians didn't regard shepherds highly in that society, because the Egyptians, look at the structures that they built, look at the engineering, look at the arts, look at all of these things that they had within the society. So shepherds were not highly regarded. And so Moses did not have that experience growing up being detested. No, Moses actually grew up within the courts of Pharaoh. And Moses understood what it was like to have everything in abundance. He understood what it was like to operate within a space of might and power, military power, political power, economic power. That is what he understood, and that is what he grew up within that environment. And Moses didn't tend to the stupid sheep. No, Moses went to university. No, Moses understood the corporate world of Egypt. He saw the good and the bad of government. He saw how the pharaohs were making decisions, and God allowed him to see those type of things. But God could not allow Moses to lead the people out of Egypt, only being schooled in the ways of Egypt. And God had to find a way and a person to get to Moses and help Moses transition and transform that understanding. Moses couldn't just be a slave and leading out the people, because he had to understand what it was like to have governance in place. He had to understand how the economy works, all of these things. And God allowed him to see that within the courts of Pharaoh. But he couldn't function like the Pharaoh of the time. And he couldn't function like a slave as well, because as a slave, he would not have understood international relations. As a slave, he would not have understood the value of work, because to a slave, work is punishment. To a slave, work is not that thing which is a blessing from God, because the master will tell you, go there and you go forth. It will tell you, go over there and you go forth. But now, God made that Moses became a stumbling block to the Israelites. Yes, and that's why one of the Israelites said to him, who made you ruler over us? I know what you did. You're a murderer. And you grew up and yeah, I'm adding. So obviously it's within the context of you grew up in the courts of Pharaoh. So who are you to come and tell us here about what we should do and we should not do? And when Pharaoh heard of this, he tried to kill Moses. And Moses fled and he went to live in Midian, where he sat down by a well. And it says, now a priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came to draw water and fill the troughs to water their father's flock. And some shepherds came along and drove them away, but Moses got up and came to rescue and watered their flock. Now this is how Moses is introduced into the life of Jethro, but it's also how Jethro gets introduced into the life of Moses. And in 40 years, in those 40 years in Midian, Moses had to learn how to worship God. And he was taught by this priest of Midian. He was taught how to put away self and to listen to God. He was taught that he had to put away the corrupt and deceitful desires and to make new the attitude of his mind, and to put on a new self and to be created like God in true righteousness and holiness. Now, he learned under the tutelage of the priest of Midian, Jethro, to be like as a prisoner for the Lord, to live a life worthy of the calling that you've received. And he was called to be a deliverer, but he had to live a life worthy of that calling. And it meant that he had to learn how to be humble and gentle and patient and bearing with one another in love. But who was Jethro? Because Jethro was not a Hebrew. He was not a descendant of Jacob. And so within that context, let's go to Genesis 25. Go to Genesis 25. And you will see it says, verse 1, Abraham married Keturah. And Keturah means fragrance. So Abraham, Sarah has passed on long ago. Isaac just got married, and Jacob in his old age, he marries this woman whose name means fragrance. And they had 6 sons called Zimran, Joksan, Medan, Midian, Ishbak, and Shua. And Midian is the father of the Midianites. And Midian grew up within the house of Abraham. And Midian saw and understood how Abraham worshipped God, how Abraham fellowshipped with God and brought sacrifices before God. And that is why Jethro, as a descendant of Abraham, might not have been through the lineage of Jacob, but through the lineage of Midian, this priest of Midianites, this priest of the Midianites who understood government, who understood governance, who understood how to manage a people. This man taught Moses, and Moses saw how God was worshipped. And that is why I believe that when Moses was on the mountain and he heard the voice from the burning bush, he could say, "Here am I." He didn't wonder. But God assured him and he said, "I'm the God of your father, of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." And so you need sometimes a Jethro in your life that you can observe, that you can see how this person worships God, and not so that you are attracted to that person, but that that person disciples you unto Christ, unto God. Now next week, I will continue with this message and I will show you that Jethro was actually a man of color. He was somebody who could help Moses put things in place so that Moses could lead and administer the people of God. Have a wonderful, wonderful day. Blessings to you.